The first discussions about forming a Masonic Lodge in the University District of Seattle, which is where our lodge is still located, those discussions began in the summer of 1904. And a group of our charter members, a small group of Masons who were members of St. John's, and mostly of St. John's, but of some of the other lodges in Seattle, met in the real estate office of one of the brethren of the lodge, Worshipful Brother Fred Rood, who was a real estate agent and developer, principally in what was then known as University Station, just west of the University of Washington. And one of the first newspaper announcements that we were able to find was actually from August 31st, 1904, when it was announced that a group of Masons in the University District wanted to create a new lodge and receive a dispensation. And ultimately, we received our dispensation in, excuse me, late 1904. Excuse me. And then we received our charter in June 1905. And what was really fascinating is that at the time, well, up until fairly recently, the Grand Lodge of Washington also was in charge not only of, had dominion over Masonic lodges in Washington state, but also in Alaska. So, they had charge of lodges in Alaska. And at the same meeting of the Grand Lodge in June of 1905, the numbering of our lodge and Anvil Lodge in Nome, Alaska was actually confused. Our Grand Secretary at the time was really ill and ultimately died later in 1905. Excuse me. And so there was a little bit of confusion over our numbering. And so we were in University Lodge was initially number 140, and then Anvil Lodge was 141, but ultimately those numbers were flipped so that Anvil ended up being 140 and we ended up being 141. And of course, when the Alaska created their Grand Lodge, I believe it was in the late 1990s or the early 2000s, all the lodges were renumbered in the order that they were chartered up there. And so initially, for the first few years that our lodge met, we met in a rented hall on the second floor of a space known as Sherrick's Hall. Excuse me. And Sherrick's Hall was located at the southwest corner of what is now Northeast 42nd Street and University Way in the University District, a few blocks south of where we currently have our lodge. And we met there until, just all the various organizations. Sherrick's Hall was one of the only large meeting spaces in University Station. And so, the lodge, had to share with a lot of other organizations in that meeting space. And so, very quickly discussions began about the possibility of constructing an actual lodge building to house University Lodge number 141. And so those discussions continued, from the early days, like 1907 into 1908. And then in October of 1908, the brethren actually acquired a property in the University Station University District, and located at the southeast corner of Northeast 45th Street and University Way. And that was where that was selected as the site for our new building. And the plans, the newspaper announcement said that the plans had not been announced yet at that time. And there was actually relatively little, really covered in the newspapers. at all. Seattle Times, Seattle Post-Intelligencer, as far as I can tell, I've not been able to locate any mention of the actual construction of the building until after it was long completed. And my thinking, for why this was the case is due to the 1909 Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, which took place on what is now the grounds in the University of Washington. And that World's Fair took place, and there was a building called the Masonic Building at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. And our building was also called the Masonic Building. And so I believe that our Masonic building got completely overshadowed by the much more prominent but temporary Masonic building that was built at the 1909 AYPE. And so it was an initial stumbling block to the research to just kind of hit this wall and realize, when I was looking at the newspapers, that they were talking about a building that was not our building, it was another building entirely. And so that ultimately, I split off that as a whole separate project because it just turned into a rabbit hole that needed further exploration. So the Masonic building at the 1909 Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition got split off into its own research effort, while I continued to concentrate on the research efforts on our building. And so ultimately, I discovered through building permit records that a Norwegian immigrant by the name of John Schultz designed and constructed our building that we use to this day. And it's a load-bearing brick masonry building with a wood frame structure on the interior. And Schultz was what would best be described in today's terminology as a structural engineer. He had received his education in Norway and immigrated to the United States in 1890. Worked in a variety of roles, including for a period of time for the American Bridge Company, which constructed massive steel bridges for railroads and highways in the early 20th century. And he ended up moving to the West Coast by the early 1900s and settled first in San Francisco. And following the San Francisco earthquake of April 1906, he was instrumental in the rebuilding of San Francisco, creating fireproof and earthquake-resistant buildings, tall buildings, very large buildings. And he ended up coming to Seattle in 1907, where he first worked for the City of Seattle Building Department as the Assistant Superintendent of Buildings. And what was really interesting is, and I've recently done some additional research into the building department, but the building department, when Schultz joined the building department as Assistant Superintendent of Buildings, the building department was headed by an architect by the name of William Grant, who was actually a Mason, and very prominent Mason, charter member of the Nile Shrine, very, very active in Seattle Masonic circles, and later actually designed a Masonic Temple in Shoreline in the early 1920s. But so Schultz ended up working in the same department as Grant. What's really interesting is that I have uncovered no indication that Schultz was a Mason. I've been in contact with one of his descendants who lives in Southern California, who, when I contacted her through Ancestry, she was completely over the moon because nobody in their family had known anything about their ancestors' activities in Seattle. and all the buildings that he worked on here and also in San Francisco. But as far as I can tell, he was not a Mason. And there's really no indication, there's no evidence or proof as to how he came to be associated with the University Lodge number 141 and how he ended up creating their building. And so it just kind of seems like a matter of expediency. You know, they needed a building constructed, and he was a very competent designer. I can make all sorts of speculation about how that happened, but unfortunately, I can't prove any of it. I think we all know how the Masonic telegraph works, and how we communicate amongst ourselves. So, you know, it's highly likely, you know, that someone talked to someone, and he ended up doing the building. But it was constructed very rapidly. It was constructed, you know, for a very reasonable amount of money, which is certainly not the case when it comes to construction these days. And let's see if I can find that number. I think it was something like $18,000 or something like that. It was a very, very small number. $12,000. It was constructed for $12,000. It was the building permit valuation, which equates to $328,000 in today's money. Unfortunately, the City of Seattle Building Department operations at that time, they discarded all the building plans after a year and only retained a small handful of the building plans of some of the more prominent buildings in Seattle. And so unfortunately, we don't have a copy of the original drawings. But the building was complete in time for the first meeting to take place in the building on October 18th, 1909. And what's really interesting is that I'm still trying to discover if our building was actually ever formally dedicated. It appears that it may not have actually ever been formally dedicated. And it also does not have a cornerstone, which cornerstones are usually a very important part of Masonic buildings. In many cases, when possible, the cornerstone is placed in the same position in the building, you know, from building to building. So it's really kind of interesting. You know, the building was finished and just put into use almost immediately with no discussion. The first newspaper reference to the building actually being used and open, the first reference that I came across in the newspaper was actually about another fraternal organization using the building, you know, because the Order of the Eastern Star used it, and also the what is now a very politically incorrect fraternal order. I think it was the Order of Red Men, you know, which also met in the building initially. But we were very fortunate, you know, to have, excuse me, we were very fortunate to have that early photograph of the building, you know, that shows what the building looked like, you know, not long after it was finished. And so that photo was just really, it provided a wealth of information about, you know, some of the other things, you know, that went on with the building. The University Station branch post office was located on the ground floor of our building from 1909 until 1914, you know, and so that U.S. government lease, you know, the power of that lease helped us finance the original construction of the building. And, you know, so there was retail spaces and a post office on the ground floor. And then on the second floor, doctors and dentists ended up having some offices up there to kind of help defray the ongoing operating costs of the building. And so, you know, it really started out as just trying to find out who the architect and builder of the building was, and they were one and the same. It was this John Schultz gentleman, and ultimately he ended up leaving Seattle not long after our building was finished. and had a very long career in Southern California, in Long Beach and in the Venice area around Los Angeles. And ultimately, they ended up, the family changed their name in 1918 because it sounded too German. And so there was a lot of anti-German sentiment related to World War I. And he died in the early 1930s. But it's a complete mystery as to how he came to be the architect and builder of our lodge. Especially when it's like compared against all the other research that I've been doing on other Masonic buildings in Seattle, and then, that they were designed by, architects who were also Masons. Probably the most prominent example is the original main Masonic Temple that was located, at Harvard and Pine, in what is now the Capitol Hill neighborhood. And that was designed by the architects Saunders and Lawton. And the competition for that building that was held in, I believe it was 1910 or 1911, that competition was only open to Masonic architects. And so, I believe it was something like 12 or 13 architects and architecture firms competed against each other for that. So, in kind of summary, I mean, our building kind of ended up being just, even though it has ended up being extremely significant, as what I believe, what my research indicates, is the second oldest purpose-built Masonic lodge building in Seattle. There's other older ones in King County, where Seattle is located, but within the city limits of Seattle, we have the second oldest Masonic lodge building. And it just really got kind of lost in the shuffle, is probably the best way to describe it. There was just so much going on in Seattle at the time period, and so much going on in Freemasonry in general, that it just kind of, that early history just got lost by the wayside. So it really ended up being just a reclamation of that history, rediscovery and reclamation of that history. But it ended up being, I think, much more fascinating than anybody initially believed.